Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Charlotte, and this is Quarantine Storytime. Oh, hi! Mom's here already. She beat me. Ha ha ha. Welcome. We are reading more War and Peace, and guys, we are making progress. As you know from the last reading yesterday, we are now 2/3 of the way through the book, which is exciting, but also I think we're going to really have to put our backs into it and really going to press in, try to get a little bit more done in the next month. I think if we really buckled down, I think we could get it finished in like a month. So that's kind of my goal. Though, I mean, I guess that kind of like starts tomorrow. Well, we're doing a decent reading today. Today we will read, so volume 3, part 2. We're going to read to the end of part 2, which is sections 35 through 39. But yeah, I think we can get this done, like I said, if we really kind of put the pedal to the metal. We're getting really, really close here. So I think we could really get to, wow, this epilogue is really long. I wonder if that's like part. I'll have to check that out. Because in the end of the book, there's like an epilogue, and then there's also like an appendix and all these notes and stuff like that. So we're definitely not reading the appendix, but I think the epilogue seems related. But anyways, I'm rambling. Hello. So if you need to get caught up, feel free to check out the playlist on my channel. Also, everyone, keep Lebanon and Beirut in your prayers or good thoughts or whatever you do today, as there was a big explosion in the port area in downtown Beirut. Several people have died. It appears to be an accident right now, is what they're thinking, but it just happened. It was a massive explosion, so much so that like windows all over the city were blown out from the shockwave. So it was quite large. Check out the news feed. I don't know that a lot of local news feeds are covering it, but in the US, but definitely check that out. If you have any friends in the Middle East, check in on them. It appears to be like a large industrial accident, but it's sad because there definitely has been loss of life and destruction of a refugee school. And so our prayers and best wishes are going to, and thoughts are going to the Lebanese people right now, who are already under sort of a dire economic situation. So there's that. Meanwhile, in War and Peace, back in the year 1812, Napoleon looks like he is about to lose a battle for is maybe almost the first time against the Russian army in the Battle of Borodino. So this is like the 26th of August, 1812. I mean, as we remember, Pierre was kind of hanging out with the army, just tootling along. And yeah, so I think we're going to pick up with some of the other characters who are present in that battle, as many of our favorite characters are all in the army and a part of that battle right now. At least the male characters, obviously. So yeah, I'm less caffeinated today. So let's jump in. Section 35. Kutuzov sat, hanging his gray head and his heavy body sagging, on the rug-covered bench in the same place where Pierre had seen him in the morning. He did not give any instructions, but only agreed or disagreed with what was suggested to him. Yes, do that, he said to various suggestions. Yes, go, dear boy. Have a look, he said, now to one of his attendants, now to another. Or, he said, no, there's no need. We'd better wait. He listened to the reports brought to him, gave orders when his subordinates demanded it, but as he listened to the reports, it seemed that he was not interested in the meaning of the words being said to him, but that something else in the expression of the face, in the tone of the reporter's speech, interested him. By many years of military experience, he knew, and by his old man's mind, he understood that one man cannot lead hundreds of thousands of men struggling with death, and he knew that the fate of a battle is decided not by the commander-in-chief's instructions, not by the position of the troops, not by the number of cannons or peoples killed, but by that elusive force known as the spirit of the troops, and he watched this force and guided it as far as that lay in his power. The general expression of Kutuzov's face was one of concentrated, calm attention and a strain that barely overcame the weariness of a weak and old body. By 11 o'clock in the morning, he was brought news that the flèches occupied by the French had been retaken, but that Prince Bagration had been wounded. Kutuzov said, "Ah," and shook his head. "Ride to Prince Pyotr Ivanovich and find out what and how in detail," he said to one of his adjutants, and then turned to the Duke of Württemberg, who was standing behind him. "May I ask your Highness to accept command of the First Army?" Soon after the Duke's departure, as so soon he could not yet have reached Semyonovsko, the Duke's adjutant came back from him and reported to His Serenity that the Duke requested more troops. Kutuzov winced and sent an order to Dokhtorov to assume command of the First Army and asked the Duke to come back, saying he could not do without him in these important moments. When news was brought that Murat had been taken prisoner and that the staff officers congratulated Kutuzov, he smiled. "Wait, gentlemen," he said. "The battle is won and the capture of Murat is nothing extraordinary, but we'd better wait before we rejoice." However, he sent an adjutant to spread this news among the troops. When Shcherbinin came galloping from the left flank with reports that the French had taken the flèches and Semyonovsko, Kutuzov, guessing by the sounds from the battlefield and Shcherbinin Shcherbin's face that the news was bad, got up as if to stretch his legs, and taking Shcherbinin's arm, led him aside. "Go there, dear boy," he said to Ermolov. "See if anything can be done." Kutuzov was in Gorky, at the center of the Russian army's position. Napoleon's attack on our left flank had been repulsed several times. In the center, the French had moved no further than Borodino. On their left flank, Uvarov's cavalry had put the French to flight. After 2 o'clock, the French attacks ceased. On all the faces of those who came from the battlefield and of those who stood around him, Kutuzov read an expression of tension that had reached the highest degree. Kutuzov was pleased with the success of the day, which was beyond expectation. But the old man's physical powers were failing him. Several times his head dropped as if falling, and he dozed off. They served him dinner. The imperial adjutant Wolzogen, the same one who, riding past Prince Andrei, had said that the war should be in Ram-Verlegen, and whom Bagration hated so much, rode up to Kutuzov during dinner. Wolzogen came from Barclay with a report on the course of things on the left flank. The sensible Barclay de Tolly, seeing crowds of retreating wounded and the disorderly rear guard of the army, having weighed all the circumstances, decided that the battle was lost and sent his favorite to the commander-in-chief with that information. Kutuzov was chewing roast chicken with difficulty and glanced at Wolzogen with narrowed, merry eyes. Wolzogen, stretching his legs casually, with a half-contemptuous smile on his lips, went up to Kutuzov, touching the visor of his cap slightly. Wolzogen treated His Serenity with a certain affected casualness, intended to show that, as a highly educated military man, he left it to the Russians to make an idol of this old, useless man, while he knew whom he was dealing with. Der Alt Herr, as the Germans called Kutuzov in their circle, macht sich ganz bequem. He makes himself quite comfortable, thought Wolzogen, and glancing sternly at the plates in front of Kutuzov, he began to report to the old gentleman the state of things on the left flank, as Barclay had reported him to do, and as he himself had seen and understood it. "All the points of opposition are in the hands of the enemy, and they cannot be repulsed because there are no troops. They are running away, and it is not possible to stop them," he reported. Kutuzov stopped chewing, and in astonishment, as if not understanding what he was being told, fixed his eyes on Wolzogen. Wolzogen, noticing the agitation des alten Herrn, said with a smile, "I do not consider it right for me to conceal from your Serenity what I saw. The troops are in total disarray." You saw? Kutuzov shouted, frowning, and rising quickly, he went up close to Wolzogen. How dare you?" he shouted, making threatening gestures with his trembling hands and sputtering. "How dare you, my dear sir, say that to me? You know nothing. Tell General Barclay from me that his information is incorrect and that the true course of the battle is known better to me, the commander-in-chief, than to him." Wolzogen was about to make some objections, but Kutuzov cut him out. "The enemy has been repulsed on the left and beaten on the right flank. If you see so poorly, my dear sir, don't allow yourself to speak of what you do not know. Kindly go to General Barclay and tell him that I firmly intend to attack the enemy tomorrow," Kutuzov said sternly. Everyone fell silent, and nothing was heard but the heavy breathing of the puffing old general. "They've been repulsed everywhere, and for which I thank God and our brave army. The enemy is defeated, and tomorrow we will be driving him out of the holy Russian land," said Kutuzov, crossing himself, and he suddenly choked from tears welling up in him. Wolzogen, shrugging his shoulders and twisting his lips, silently stepped away, surprised, über dies Eingenommenheit des alten Herrn, at the old gentleman's self-conceit. "Yes, here he is, my hero," said Kutuzov to the stout, handsome, black-haired general who was coming up onto the barrow at that moment. This was Revsky, who had spent the whole day at the main point of the field of Borodino. Revsky reported that the troops had stood their ground firmly and that the French no longer dared to attack. Having heard him out, Kutuzov said in French, "Vous ne pensez donc pas comme après que nous sommes obligés de nous retirer? So you don't think, like others, that we're obliged to retreat?" "Au contraire, votre Altesse, dans les affaires indécises, c'est toujours le plus opiniâtre qui reste victorieux," replied Revsky. "En mon opinion, on the contrary, Your Highness, it is in undecided affairs, it is always the most stubborn one who remains victorious. And my opinion." "Kasarov," Kutuzov called his adjutant, "sit down and write the order for tomorrow. And you," he turned to another, "ride to the line and announce that tomorrow we attack." While the conversation with Revsky was going on and the order was being dictated, Wolzogen came back from Barclay and reported that General Barclay de Tolly would like to have a written confirmation of the order given by the field marshal. Kutuzov, without glancing at Wolzogen, ordered the order to be written, which, on very good grounds, to avoid personal responsibility, the former commander-in-chief wished to have. And by some indefinable mysterious connection, which maintains the same mood through the entire army, which is known as the spirit of the army, and constitutes the central nerve of war, Kutuzov's words, his order to fight the next day, were conveyed simultaneously to all ends of the army. It was far from the same words, the same order that passed through the last links of the chain. There was even no resemblance between the stories that were passed from man to man at different ends of the army and what Kutuzov had said, but the sense of his words communicated itself everywhere, because what Kutuzov had said came not from clever consideration, but from the feeling that was in the soul of the commander-in-chief, just as it was in the soul of every Russian man. And learning that we would attack the enemy the next day, hearing from the high spheres of the army that confirmation of what they wanted to believe, the exhausted, vacillating men were comforted and reassured. Section 36. Prince Andrei's regiment was in the reserves, which till past 1 o'clock were stationed behind Semyonovsko, inactive under heavy artillery fire. Towards 2 o'clock, the regiment, having lost over 200 men already, was moved forward onto a trampled oat field to the space between Semyonovsko and the battery of the Barrow, where thousands of men were killed that day, and at which, between 1 o'clock and 2 o'clock, the intensely concentrated fire of several hundred enemy guns was directed. Without leaving the spot or firing a single shot, the regiment here lost another third of its men. In front, and especially to the right, in the never-dispersing smoke, cannon boomed, and out of the mysterious zone of smoke that lay over the whole terrain ahead, without ceasing, flew cannonballs with a hissing, rapid whistle, and slowly whistling shells. Sometimes, as if granting a respite, there would be a quarter of an hour when all the cannonballs and shells overshot, but sometimes several men were taken out of the regiment in the space of a single minute, and the dead and wounded were constantly being carried off. With each new blow, the chances of survival for those who had not yet been killed grew less and less. The regiment stood by battalions and columns 300 paces apart, but despite that, the men of the regiment were all under the sway of the same mood. The men of the regiment were all equally silent and gloomy. Talk here was heard rarely among the ranks, but that talk would fall silent each time they heard a shot strike home and the cry, "Stretcher!" Most of the time, the men of the regiment, on orders from their superiors, sat on the ground. One, taking off his shako, carefully undid and redid the gathers. Another, crumbling some dry clay between his palms, polishing his bayonet. A third worked the leather and readjusted the buckle of his bandolier. Yet another carefully spread out his footcloth, wound it up again, and put his boot back on. Some built little houses from the clods of the field or plaited little baskets out of straw. They all seemed fully immersed in these occupations. When men were wounded or killed, when stretchers were carried past, when our troops retreated, when the large masses of the enemy were seen through the smoke, no one paid any attention to these circumstances. But when the artillery or cavalry advanced, or movements of our infantry could be seen, approving remarks could be heard on all sides. But the general attention was accorded to the totally extraneous events, which had no relation to the battle. It was as if the attention of these morally exhausted men found rest in these ordinary, everyday events. An artillery battery was passing by in front of the regiment. The outrunner of one of the artillery caissons stepped over a trace. "Hey, that outrunner! Put it right! It'll fall!" They don't see it," men shouted from the ranks all through the regiment. Another time, general attention was drawn to a little brown dog with a stiffly raised tail, who, coming from God knows where, trotted out in front of the ranks with a preoccupied air, and when a cannonball suddenly hit close by, squealed and dashed off, its tail between its legs. Guffaws and squeals came from all over the regiment. But distractions of this sort lasted only a few minutes. While the men who had been standing for more than 8 hours with no food and with nothing to do, under the relentless terror of death, their pale and frowning faces grew more pale and frowning. Prince Andrei, frowning and pale like all the men of the regiment, paced up and down the meadow next to the oat field, from one edge to the other, his hands behind his back, his head bowed. There was nothing left for him to do or to order. Everything was being done by itself. The dead were dragged back from behind the front line. The wounded were carried away. The ranks closed up. If soldiers ran off, they came hurrying back at once. At first, Prince Andrei walked up and down the ranks, considering it his duty to rouse the courage of the soldiers and set them an example. But then he realized that he had nothing to teach them. All the forces of his soul, as of every soldier, were unconsciously bent solely on keeping himself from contemplating the horror of the situation they were in. He paced over the meadow, dragging his feet, scuffing up the grass, and observing the dust that covered his boots. Now he took big steps, trying to get into the footprints left on the meadow by the mowers. Then he counted his steps, trying to reckon up how many times he had to go from edge to make a mile. Then he pulled off the flowers of the wormwood that grew along the edge, and rubbed those flowers between his palms, sniffing the fragrantly bitter, strong smell. Of all his mental work the day before, nothing remained. He was not thinking about anything. He listened with weary ear to the same sounds, distinguishing the whistle of projectiles from the roar of cannon fire, looking at the familiar faces of the 1st Battalion, and waited. "Here it comes. This one's for us again," he thought, listening to the approaching whistle of something from the hidden zone of smoke. One, another, more! A hit! He stopped and looked at the ranks. No, an overshot. But that one's a hit, and he began pacing again, trying to take big strides so as to reach the edge in 16 steps. A whistle, a thud! 5 paces from him, a cannonball dug up the dry earth and disappeared. An involuntary chill ran down his spine. He glanced at the ranks. Many had probably been taken out. A large crowd gathered by the 2nd Battalion. "Mr. Adjutant," he shouted, "order them not to crowd around." The adjutant, having carried out the order, was coming towards Prince Andrei. From the other side of the battalion commander rode up. "Look out!" came a soldier's frightened cry, and like a little bird whistling over in a quick flight and alighting to the ground, a shell dully plopped down within 2 paces of Prince Andrei, near the battalion commander's horse. The horse, first of all, not asking whether it was good or bad to show fear, snorted, reared up, and nearly throwing the major, leapt aside. The horse's terror communicated itself to the man. "Get down!" cried the voice of the adjutant, throwing himself to the ground. Prince Andrei stood undecided. The shell was smoking, spitting like a top between him and the prone adjutant, on the border between the field and the meadow, near a bush of wormwood. "Can this be death?" thought Prince Andrei, gazing with completely new, envious eyes at the grass, at the wormwood, and at the little stream of smoke curling up from the spitting black ball. "No, I can't. I don't want to die. I love life. I love this grass, the earth, the air." He was thinking all that, and at the same time remembered that he was being looked at. "Shame on you, officer. What an—" And he did not finish. At one and the same time there was a sound of an explosion, a whistling of splinters as if from a shattered window, a choking smell of powder, and Prince Andrei hurtled sideways and, raising his arm, fell on his chest. Several officers ran to him. From the right side of his stomach, a large stain of blood was spreading onto the grass. The summoned militiamen stopped behind the officers. Prince Andrei lay on his chest, his face lowered to the grass, and was breathing in heavy gasps. "Well, what are you standing there for? Come here." The muzhiks came over and took hold of him by the shoulders and legs, but he moaned pitifully, and the muzhiks, exchanging glances, let go of him. "Pick him up, lay him out, it's all the same," cried someone's voice. They took hold of him again by the shoulders and laid him on a stretcher. "Oh, my God, what is it? The stomach? That's the end. Oh, my God," voices were heard from the officers. "It whizzed just a hair away from my ear," said the adjutant. The muzhiks, hoisting the stretcher on their shoulders, started down the path they had trodden to the dressing station. "Keep in step, you clodhoppers," cried an officer, stopping the muzhiks by the shoulder as they walked off unevenly, jolting the stretcher. "Come on, fall in, Fyodor, fall in," said the muzhik in front. "Then, there we go, that's grand," said the one behind said joyfully, falling into step. "Your Excellency, Prince Andrei," Timokin said in a trembling voice, running up and looking into the stretcher. Prince Andrei opened his eyes, looked out from the stretcher into which his head had sunk deeply, as the one who was speaking, and lowered his eyelids again. The militiamen brought Prince Andrei to the woods where the cart stood and where the dressing station was. The dressing station consisted of 3 tents with turned-back flaps pitched at the end of a birch grove. In the birch grove stood carts and horses. The horses were eating oats from their nosebags, and sparrows flew down to them, pecking up the spilled grain. Crows, scenting blood, crowing impatiently, flew about in the birches. Around the tents, over more than 5 acres, bloodied men lay, sat, or stood in various cloths. Around the wounded, with dejected, attentive faces, stood crowds of stretcher-bearers, whom the officers in charge of keeping order tried in vain to drive away from the place. Not heeding the officers, the bearers stood leaning on the stretchers, and, as if trying to comprehend the difficult meaning of the spectacle, looked intently at what was going on before them. From the tent came now loud, angry screams or pitiful wailing. Occasionally surgeons' assistants ran out to fetch water and pointed to those who were to be carried in. The wounded, waiting their turn by the tents, wheezed, moaned, wept, shouted, cursed, begged for vodka. Some were delirious. As Prince Andrei was a regimental commander, the bearers, stepping among the not yet treated men, brought him close to one of the tents and stopped, waiting for orders. Prince Andrei opened his eyes and for a long time could not understand what was happening around him. He remembered the meadow, the wormwood, the field, the black spinning ball, and his passionate fit of love for life. 2 steps away from him, talking loudly and attracting general attention to himself, stood a tall, handsome, black-haired sergeant leaning on a branch, his head bandaged. He had bullet wounds in his head and leg. Around him, listening eagerly to his talk, gathered a crowd of wounded and stretcher bearers. "We just pounded him out of there. He dropped everything. We caught the king himself," the soldier shouted, looking around him, his black, inflamed eyes glittering. "If only the reservers had come just then, brothers, he wouldn't even have left his name behind. It's the truth I'm telling you." Prince Andrei, like everyone else around the narrator, looked at him with shining eyes and experienced a comforting feeling. But does it make any difference now, he thought? And what will be there, and what will there have been here? Why was I so sorry to part with life? There was something in this life that I didn't and still don't understand. Section 37. One of the doctors came out of the tent in a bloody apron with small bloody hands, in one of which, between the thumb and little finger, so as not to stain it, he was holding a cigar. The doctor raised his head and began looking from side to side, but over the heads of the wounded. He obviously wanted to rest a little. Turning his head to the right and left for some time, he sighed and lowered his eyes. "Right now," he said, to the words of the assistant who was pointing to Prince Andrei and ordered him to be brought into the tent. A murmur arose in the crowd of the waiting wounded. "Looks like in the next world, too, only the masters'll have it good," one said. Prince Andrei was brought in and laid on a just-vacated table from which an assistant was rinsing something. Prince Andrei could not sort out separately what was in the tent. The pitiful moans on all sides, the tormenting pain in his hip, stomach, and back distracted him. Everything he saw around him merged for him into a general impression of bared, bloody human flesh, which seemed to fill this low tent, as several weeks ago, on that hot August day, that same flesh had filled the dirty pool on the Smolensk road. Yes, it was the same flesh, the same chair à canon, a sight of which, already then, as if foretelling the present, had filled him with horror. There were 3 tables in the tent. 2 were occupied. Prince Andrei was laid on the third. He was left alone for a time. He involuntarily saw what was taking place on the other 2 tables. On the table near sat a Tartar, probably a Cossack, judging by the uniform thrown down next to him. 4 soldiers were holding him back. A doctor in spectacles was cutting at something in his brown, muscular back. "Ugh, ugh, ugh!" The Tartar was as if grunting, and suddenly lifting up his high-cheeked, dark, snub-nosed face and baring his white teeth, he began to strain, pull, and shriek in a piercing, ringing, drawn-out shriek. On the other table, around which many people crowded, a big, sturdy man lay on his back, with his head thrown back. His curly hair, its color, and the shape of his head seemed strangely familiar to Prince Andrei. Several assistants leaned their weight on the man's chest and held him down. One big, sturdy, white leg kept jerking quickly and rhythmically with feverish quivering. The man sobbed and spluttered convulsively. 2 doctors, one was pale and trembling, were silently doing something to the man's other leg, which was red. Having finished with the Tartar, over whom an overcoat was thrown, the doctor in spectacles, wiping his hands, came up to Prince Andrei. He looked at Prince Andrei's face and quickly turned away. "Undress him! What are you standing there for?" he cried angrily to the assistants. His very first distant childhood came to Prince Andrei's mind as the assistant, his sleeves rolled up, unbuttoned, and removed his clothes with hurrying hands. The doctor bent down over the wound, felt it, and sighed deeply. Then he made a sign to someone, and the tormenting pain inside his stomach made Prince Andrei lose consciousness. When he came to, the shattered hip bones had been removed, the shreds of flesh had been cut off, and the wound had been dressed. Someone sprayed water in his face. As soon as Prince Andrei opened his eyes, the doctor bent over him, silently kissed him on the lips, and hurried away. After the suffering he had endured, Prince Andrei felt a bliss such as he had not experienced for a long time. All the best and happiest moments of his life, especially his most distant childhood, when he had been undressed and put in his little bed, when the nanny had sung to lull him to sleep, when burying his head in the pillows he felt happy in the mere consciousness of life, presented itself to his imagination, not as a past, but as a reality. The doctors were bustling about a wounded man, the shape of whose head seemed familiar to Prince Andrei. They were lifting him and calming him. "Show me! Oh, oh!" he moaned. His moaning, broken by sobs, was heard, frightened and resigning to his suffering. Hearing these moans, Prince Andrei wanted to weep, whether it was because he was dying without glory, or because he was sorry to part with life, or from those memories of long-distant childhood, or because he was suffering, others were suffering, and this man was moaning so pitifully before him, he wanted to weep, childlike, kind, almost joyful tears. The wounded man was shown his cut-off leg in a boot, caked with blood. "Oh, oh!" he sobbed like a woman. The doctor, who was standing in front of the wounded man, screening his face, stepped away. "My God, what is this? Why is he here?" Prince Andrei said to himself. In the unfortunate, sobbing, exhausted man whose leg had just been removed, he recognized Anatoly Kuragin. They were holding him up in their arms and offering him water in a glass, the rim of which he could not catch in his trembling, swollen lips. Anatoly was sobbing deeply. "Yes, it's he. Yes, this man is closely and painfully connected with me by something," thought Prince Andrei, not yet understanding clearly what he saw before him. "What is this man's connection with my childhood, with my life?" he asked himself, without finding an answer. And suddenly a new and unexpected memory from the worst of childhood, purity, and love came to Prince Andrei. He remembered Natasha as he had seen her for the first time at the ball in 1810, with her slender neck and arms, with her frightened, happy face ready for rapture, and in his soul and tenderness for her awakened, and in his soul, love and tenderness for her awakened, stronger and more alive than ever. He now remembered the connection between him and this man, who was looking at him dully through the tears that filled his swollen eyes. Prince Andrei remembered everything, and a rapturous pity and love for this man filled his happy heart. Prince Andrei could no longer restrain himself. He wept tender, loving tears over people, over himself, over their and his own errors. Compassion, love for our brothers, for those who love us, for those who hate us, love for our enemies. Yes, that love which God preached on earth, which Princess Maria taught me, and which I didn't understand. That's why I'm sorry about life. That's what's still left for me, if I was to live. But now it's too late. I know it. Section 38. The dreadful sight of the battlefield, covered with corpses and wounded, combined with the heaviness of the head, and with the news that 20 generals he knew well had been killed or wounded, and with the awareness of the impotence of his once strong arm, made an unexpected impression on Napoleon, who ordinarily liked to survey the dead and wounded, thereby testing his inner strength, as he thought. On that day, the terrible sight of the battlefield overcame that inner strength in which he placed his merit and greatness. He hastily left the battlefield and returned to the Shevardino barrow. Yellow, bloated, heavy, with dull eyes, a red nose, and a hoarse voice, he sat on a camp chair, involuntarily listening to the sounds of gunfire and not raising his eyes. With sickly anguish he awaited the end of this action, of which he considered himself the cause, but which he was unable to stop. Personal human feelings for a brief moment got the upper hand over that artificial phantom of life which he had served so long. He transferred to himself the sufferings and death he had seen on the battlefield. The heaviness in his head and chest reminded him of the possibility of his own suffering and death. At that moment he wanted for himself neither Moscow nor victory nor glory. What more glory did he need? The only thing he wished for now was rest, tranquility, and freedom. But when he was on the Semyonovsko heights, the artillery commander had suggested placing several batteries on those heights to increase the fire on the Russian troops crowding before Knyazkovo. Napoleon had agreed and ordered them to let him know what effects those batteries had. An adjutant came riding to tell him that, on the Emperor's orders, 200 guns had been placed on the Russians, but the Russians still stood firm. "Our fire takes them out by whole ranks, but they stand firm," said the adjutant. "Ils s'en veulent encore," Napoleon said in a hoarse voice. "They want more." "Sire," said the adjutant, who had not caught what he had said. "Il en voulait encore," Napoleon, frowning, rasped in a husky voice. "Donnez-leur en. They want more. Give it to them." And even without his order, they were doing what he wanted, and he gave the instructions only because he thought an order was expected of him. And again, he was transferred to his former artificial world of phantoms of some sort of greatness, and again, as a horse walking through a slanting treadmill imagines it is doing something for itself, he began to obediently fulfill that cruel, sad, oppressive, and inhuman role which had been assigned to him. And not only for the hour and day were reason and consciousness darkened in this man who, more than all other participants in this affair, bore upon himself the whole weight of what was happening, but never to the end of his life was he able to understand the goodness or beauty or truth or the meaning of his own actions, which were too much the opposite of goodness and truth, and too far removed from everything human for him to be able to grasp their meaning. He could not renounce his actions, extolled by half the world, and therefore he had to renounce truth and goodness and everything human. Not only on that day, riding around the battlefield strewn with dead and mutilated men, by his will, as he thought, did he, looking at these men, count how many Russians there were to one Frenchman, and deceiving himself, find cause to rejoice that for every Frenchman there were 5 Russians. Not only on that day did he write a letter to Paris that le champ de bataille est superbe, because there were 50,000 corpses on it, but also on the island of St. Helena, in the quiet of solitude, where he said he intended to devote his leisure to setting forth the great deeds he had done, he wrote, "The war in Russia should have been the most popular of modern times. It was a war of good sense and true interests, of rest and security for all. It was purely pacific and conservative. It was for the great cause, the end of uncertainties and the beginning of security. A new horizon, new works would unfold, all filled with well-being and with the prosperity of all. The European system had been founded, it was only a question of organizing it. Satisfied on these major points and at peace everywhere, I also would have had my Congress and my Holy Alliance. Those are ideas that were stolen from me. In this meeting of the great sovereigns, we would have dealt our interest as a family and accounted to the people as clerk to master. In this way, Europe would soon have become truly one people, and each person traveling everywhere would always have found himself in a common fatherland. It would have been called for all rivers to be navigable for everyone, the commonality of seas, and that the great standing armies be henceforth reduced to nothing but guards for the sovereigns. On returning to France, to the bosom of the fatherland, great, strong, magnificent, Peaceful, glorious, I would have proclaimed its limits immutable, all future wars purely defensive, and any new enlargement antinational. I would have associated my son with the empire, my dictatorship would have ended, his constitutional reign would have begun. Paris would have been the capital of the world, and French the envoy of the nations. My ensuing leisure and my old age would have been devoted, in company of the Empress and during the royal apprenticeship of my son, to visiting gradually and as a real country couple, with our own horses, every nook and cranny of the empire, receiving complaints, redressing wrongs, and scattering monuments and benefactions over all and everywhere. He, predestined by Providence for the sad, unfree role of executioner of the peoples, assured himself that the goal of his actions was the good of the people, and that he could govern the destinies of millions by means of power, be their benefactor. He wrote further of the Russian war. Of the 400,000 men who crossed the Vistula, half were Austrians, Prussians, Saxons, Poles, Bavarians, Württembergers, Mecklenburgers, Spanish, Italians, Neapolitans. The imperial army, properly speaking, was made up of 1/3 Dutch, Belgians, inhabitants of the banks of the Rhine, Piemontese, Swiss, Genoans, Tuscans, Romans, inhabitants of the 32nd Military Division, Bremen, Hamburg, etc. It counted nearly 140,000 men who spoke French. The Russian expedition cost France herself less than 50,000 men. The Russian army, in retreat from Vilno to Moscow, in different battles, lost 4 times more than the French army. The burning of Moscow cost the lives of 100,000 Russians, dead of cold and starvation in the woods. Finally, in its march from Moscow to the Oder, the Russian army also suffered from the bad winter of the season. It counted 50,000 men on its arrival to Vilno, and in Kalisz, less than 18,000. He imagined that the war with Russia had come about by his will, and the horror of what had happened did not strike his soul. He bodily took upon himself all responsibility for the event, and his darkened reason saw his justification in the fact that among the hundreds of thousands of men who perished, there were fewer Frenchmen than Hessians and Bavarians. Section 39. Several tens of thousands of men lay dead in various positions and uniforms in the fields and meadows that belonged to the Davyadov family and to crown peasants on fields and meadows where for hundreds of years peasants of the villages of Borodino, Gorky, Shevardino, and Semyonovsko had at the same time gathered crops and pastured cattle. At the dressing station, the grass and soil was soaked with blood over the space of 3 acres. Crowds of wounded and unwounded men of various units with frightened faces trudged on the one side back to Mozhaisk and on the other side back to Velevu. Other crowds, exhausted and hungry, led by their commanders, moved forward. Still others stayed put and went on shooting. Over the whole field, once so gaily beautiful with its gleaming bayonets and puffs of smoke in the morning sun, there now hung the murk of dampness and smoke and the strangely acidic smell of saltpeter and blood. Small clouds gathered, and rain began to sprinkle over the dead, the wounded, the frightened, and on the exhausted and the doubtful men. It was as if it were saying, "Enough, enough, men, stop now. Come to your senses, what are you doing?" Exhausted men on both sides, without food and rest, began alike to doubt whether they had to go on exterminating each other. Hesitation was seen on all faces, and in every soul alike the question arose, why, for whom, should I kill and be killed? You kill whomever you like, do whatever you like, but I don't want any more of it. Towards evening, this thought ripened alike in each man's soul. At any moment, all these men became terrified at what they were doing, at any moment, all these men might become horrified at what they were doing, drop everything, and run away wherever their legs took them. But though by the end of the battle the men left felt all the horror of their actions, though they would have been glad to stop, some incomprehensible, mysterious power still went on governing them, and the artillerymen, sweaty, covered with powder and blood, reduced to 1 in 3, though stumbling and gasping from fatigue, kept bringing charges, loaded, aimed, applied the slow match and the cannonballs, with the same speed and cruelty, flew from both sides and crushed human bodies flat. And the terrible thing continued to be accomplished, which was accomplished not by the will of men, but by the will of him who governs people and worlds. Anyone looking at the disordered rear of the Russian army would have said that the French needed to make one more little effort and the Russian army would have been vanished. It would have vanished. And anyone looking at the French rear would have said that the Russians needed to make one more little effort and the French would have perished. But neither the French nor the Russian made that effort, and the flame of the battle slowly burned out. The Russians did not make that effort because it was not they who were attacking the French. At the beginning of the battle, they merely stood on the way to Moscow, shielding it, and they went on standing in the same way at the end of the battle as they had at the beginning. But even if the goal of the Russians had consisted in bringing down the French, they could not have made that last effort, because all the Russian troops were battered. There was not a single army unit that had not suffered in the battle, and the Russians, while staying in their places, had lost half their troops. For the French, with the memory of all the previous 15 years of victories, with their confidence in Napoleon's invincibility, with the awareness that they had taken part of the battlefield, that they had lost only a quarter of their men, and that they still had intact the 20,000 men guard, it would have been easy to make the effort. The French, who attacked the Russian army with the goal of dislodging it from its position, ought to have made the effort, because as long as the Russian barred the road to Moscow, as they had done before the battle, the goal of the French had not been attained, and all their efforts and losses were in vain. But the French did not make that effort. Some historians say that Napoleon needed only to send his intact old guard for the battle to be won. To talk of what would have happened if Napoleon had sent in his guard is the same as talking about what would have happened if autumn became spring. It could not be. It is not that Napoleon did not send his guard because he did not want to, but that it could not be done. All the generals, officers, and soldiers of the French army knew that it could not be done because the army's fallen spirits did not allow it. It was not Napoleon alone who experienced that dreamlike feeling that the terrible swing of the arm felt strengthless, but all the generals, are the participating and non-participating soldiers of the French army, after all their experience of previous battles, where the enemy had fled after 10 times less effort, experienced the same feeling of terror before an enemy who, having lost half of his army, stood as formidably at the end as at the beginning of the battle. The moral strength of the attacking French army was exhausted. It was not that sort of victory that is determined by captured pieces of cloth on sticks, known as standards, but by the amount of ground the troops stood and stand on. But a moral victory, the sort that convinces the adversary of the moral superiority of his enemy and of his own impotence, that was gained by the Russians at Borodino. The French invasion, like an enraged beast, mortally wounded as it charges, senses its destruction, but it could not stop, just as the twice weaker Russian army could not help moving aside. After the shove it had been given, the French army could still roll on as far as Moscow, but there, with no new effort on the part of the Russian army, it was to perish, bleeding from the mortal wound it had received at Borodino. The direct consequence of the Battle of Borodino was Napoleon's causeless flight from Moscow. The return down the old Smolensk road, the destruction of an invading army of 500,000 men, and the destruction of Napoleonic France, upon which had been laid for the first time at Borodino the hand of an adversary stronger in spirit. Blah. And there you have it. That was a bit mushy. And that is the end of part 2. So, we are well on our way towards the last bit of volume 3, and then all we have is volume 4, and we're the epilogue, and we're done, friends. So there you have it. Bit of a stalemate, but in not winning, Napoleon kind of has lost here, and it will set the, as Tolstoy said, it'll set the foundation for his destruction after Moscow. So there you have it. Indeed. Excuse me. Now we see the violence inherent in the system. Come and see the violence inherent in the system. Monty Python. Well, there you have it, friends. We will pick it up tomorrow in part 3. And like I said, we will be pushing on. I'll probably try to do a little bit longer readings for the next couple weeks. So hopefully we can gain some ground over this novel. And hopefully get it finished in the next month or maybe a little less. All right. Take care. Have a great day. Happy Tuesday. Bye.